Today we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. How did the world's most formidable empire get decisively crushed by a makeshift army of civilians and merchants in the narrow streets of a colonial city?
It's quite a story.
Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description. So I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine being a soldier in the world's most feared, technologically advanced military force. You've crossed an ocean, landed on a foreign shore, and you're marching into this dusty colonial city expecting, a parade.
Right. They really thought they were getting a parade.
Exactly. Your commanders have completely assured you that the locals view you as liberators. But instead, the city itself just seems to be swallowing you alive. I mean, there's boiling water and heavy stones pouring down from these flat rooftops.
Yeah, absolute chaos.
The narrow, grid-like streets are blocked off by overturned wagons and these, fortified trenches. The local merchants, the laborers, the farmers, they're all shooting at you from their bedroom windows.
And your regiment is just completely trapped in a maze. Your artillery is totally useless.
And your general is miles away, right? Completely unaware that you're being systematically wiped out.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario for any expeditionary force. I mean, you're describing the absolute disintegration of a professional military inside what is essentially an urban meat grinder.
A total meat grinder.
Yeah. We are looking at the events of 1806 and 1807, specifically the British invasions of the Rio de la Plata, targeting Buenos Aires. And what makes this so captivating isn't just the sheer violence of the urban combat, it's the cascading series of psychological and strategic failures that led the British Empire to march blindly into that trap in the first place.
So we're unpacking the first chapter of Edward H. Whitmore's analysis of British military failures, and we're keeping our focus exclusively on Buenos Aires today. To understand how the British ended up bleeding out in those streets, we really have to pull all the way back to the global chessboard at the turn of the 19th century.
Right, you have to look at the geopolitical reality of that era. You have this massive imbalance of power. The British Empire possesses, completely undisputed naval supremacy.
Trafalgar.
Exactly. Following the Battle of Trafalgar, the Royal Navy effectively owns the world's oceans. Nobody can touch them on the water. But on land, the Napoleonic Wars are raging. France and its allies, which includes Spain at this point, are dominating the European continent.
Which puts the British in a really weird spot.
It does. That imbalance is the engine driving this entire disaster. The British Army cannot simply march a large land force into Europe without facing Napoleon's overwhelming numbers. They'd just be crushed.
So you've got British imperial planners in London sitting in their boardrooms looking at a world map, trying to figure out how to project power.
How to project power, expand their economic reach, and hurt their European rivals, all without fighting a massive land war in Europe.
And Spain is a really prime target here.
Oh, absolutely. Spain is allied with France, but the Spanish crown is severely distracted. It's administratively chaotic, and they are really struggling to maintain their grip on this massive, massive overseas empire.
So the planner's eyes land on the Rio de la Plata region, which corresponds to modern-day Argentina and Uruguay. And when we talk about this region, we need to understand the mechanism of its wealth. It wasn't just like a random spot on the map.
No, not at all. The Rio de la Plata is this massive estuarine system. It's essentially a funnel that drains a vast portion of the South American interior.
The ultimate Atlantic gateway.
Precisely. And Buenos Aires was the principal city of the Spanish viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. To understand why the British wanted it so badly, we have to look at how Spain managed its colonial economy.
Which was incredibly restrictive, right?
Very. Spain operated under a very strict mercantilist system. Think of mercantilism as a closed-loop corporate ecosystem. By law, the colonies in the Americas were completely forbidden from trading with anyone except Spain.
So they're trapped.
Completely trapped. They had to sell their raw materials. We're talking silver from Potosi, vast quantities of leather, tallow, agricultural goods, to Spanish merchants at artificially depressed prices. And then on the flip side, they were forced to buy manufactured goods only from Spain at heavily inflated prices.
So it's essentially a legally enforced monopoly. The people living in Buenos Aires are locked into a terrible economic deal.
It's a terrible deal, and it's exactly the kind of friction an opportunistic empire looks for. Buenos Aires had grown into this bustling commercial hub despite these restrictions, primarily through massive systemic smuggling.
Just black market everywhere.
Yeah, the whole economy was basically black market. It was a vital node connecting trans-Pacific trade coming over the Andes with the Atlantic trade routes.
Mm.
So for a British strategist, the logic seemed flawless.
If they could capture Buenos Aires, they could violently break that mercantilist monopoly.
Right. They wouldn't just be taking a city, they would be seizing the valve that controlled the wealth of half a continent. They could flood the South American market with cheap, mass-produced British industrial goods and extract that silver and leather directly.
Entirely bypassing Madrid.
Exactly.
So the prevailing doctrine in London was this idea of, and the source calls it this, limited military engagements for maximum economic leverage. They didn't want to conquer and govern the entire South American continent.
No, that would take hundreds of thousands of troops they didn't have.
Right. They just wanted to kick down the door, seize the port, set up a friendly administration, and let the free trade profits roll in.
The boardroom theory of economic liberation. But, this theory relied on a catastrophic misinterpretation of intelligence. The British were basing their strategy on reports from their own explorers, smugglers, and merchants who had actually visited the region.
And what were those guys saying?
Well, these reports consistently highlighted deep internal fissures within the society of Buenos Aires.
Let's break down those social fractures, because I think they are crucial to understanding why the British got so wildly overconfident. The society was incredibly stratified. You had the Peninsulares, who were Spaniards born in Europe, right?
Yes, and they held all the highest government and religious offices.
Then you had the Criollos, who were people of Spanish descent but born in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
And the Criollos were often the wealthy merchants and landowners, but they were politically marginalized by the Peninsulares.
There was profound resentment there. The Criollas generated all the wealth, but the Peninsulares hoarded all the power. Add to that the indigenous populations, the enslaved Africans, and the mixed-race castas, all of whom obviously suffered deeply under this rigid colonial hierarchy.
So the British see all this.
They do. When the British intelligence gatherers saw this resentment, they actually accurately diagnosed the disease local dissatisfaction with Spanish rule, but they prescribed a completely delusional cure.
They assumed that because the Criollos hated the Spanish trade monopoly, they would just naturally welcome the British Army as liberators. It's funny. Have you ever seen a corporate management team roll out a completely new disruptive workflow for their employees? And they assume everyone will love it just because the new software is technically, more efficient?
Oh, yeah, the classic top-down tech rollout.
Right. They know the employees hate the old legacy system. So the executives think, oh, they'll shower us with praise for bringing in this new tool. But they completely ignore the human element.
They ignore the fact that the employees might resent being forced into a new system by people who don't understand their daily lives at all.
Exactly. The executives mistake frustration with the status quo for an invitation to completely upend the culture. And that is exactly what the British planners did, just on a massive geopolitical scale.
That corporate rollout analogy captures the arrogance perfectly. The British basically assumed that economic efficiency, free trade, was the absolute only variable the locals cared about. They stripped the people of Buenos Aires of their own agency.
Which is a fatal mistake.
It is. They failed to recognize that a local population might deeply resent their current rulers, but still possess a fierce emerging sense of local identity. The Criollos wanted autonomy. They didn't want a transfer of ownership from a Spanish master to a British one.
But this boardroom theory of economic liberation didn't survive first contact with the actual physical geography. Because the British believed they were liberators, they neglected basic reconnaissance, right?
Okay.
They marched blindly into a topographical and architectural nightmare.
A total nightmare. Let's look at the operational reality. The British plan relied on what made them the most dominant force in Europe: linear tactics.
Right.
They intended to land on the shores of the Rio de la Plata, organize into their traditional columns, and literally just march directly into the city to seize the cabildo, the city hall, and the center of power.
And to understand why this approach shattered so completely, we really have to explain the mechanics of European warfare in 1806.
Yeah, we have to talk about the muskets. The standard infantry weapon was the smoothbore musket, specifically the Brown Bess for the British. Now, a smoothbore musket is essentially a highly engineered lead pipe.
A lead pipe.
Yeah, the lead ball bouncing down the barrel is not gripped by rifling grooves, meaning its trajectory is inherently unstable. If a soldier aimed at a specific target 50 yards away, there was a very high probability he would just completely miss.
So how do you actually kill the enemy if your weapon can't hit anything?
Volume. You compensate for the inaccuracy of the individual weapon by massing firepower. You line up hundreds of men shoulder to shoulder in 2 or 3 ranks. You train them to load and fire in perfect, synchronized volleys.
Just putting a wall of lead in the air.
Exactly. You are creating a wall of flying lead that sweeps across the battlefield. But doing this requires extreme formation discipline. The men must march in perfect order, stand their ground while being fired upon, and follow the centralized commands of their officers.
Which means it requires clear lines of sight and open fields.
Wide open fields.
Wait, I have to stop you there. You're saying they marched in parade formation because of musket reload speeds and accuracy? But surely the British military had engaged in sieges or irregular skirmishes before 1806.
Right.
I mean, they fought the American Revolution.
Right, they definitely did.
They knew what irregulars hiding behind trees and walls could do, so why didn't they adapt on the fly? It seems almost willfully ignorant. Did the British command genuinely believe they could just march in parade formation through an enemy city without controlling the rooftops or the side streets?
That is the critical distinction between rural irregular warfare and urban combat in a Spanish colonial city. In the American Revolution, the irregular warfare largely took place in forests and the countryside. When the British did besiege cities, they utilized traditional siege engineering.
Like digging trenches.
Right, digging parallel trenches, bringing up heavy mortars, starving the defenders out over a period of months. But Buenos Aires was an open city. It didn't have massive star-shaped European fortress walls surrounding it.
Oh, I see.
So the British commanders looked at it and thought, well, there are no walls to breach. We can just march straight to the central plaza.
But what they failed to understand was the internal architecture. Buenos Aires was built on the Damaro system.
Yes, the Damaro system.
Which is the grid system, right?
A rigid mathematical grid. The city was laid out in perfect square blocks separated by narrow, unpaved streets. When you take a European military column, which is designed to spread out into a wide line on an open field, and try to force it down a narrow street, it acts like a solid steel beam being shoved into a winding maze of pipes.
It can't bend.
It cannot bend, and more importantly, it cannot deploy its firepower.
Right, the column gets funneled. Only the first few men in the front can actually fire their weapons forward. The hundreds of men behind them are just waiting in line to be shot.
It's exactly that. And that rigid steel beam of British infantry was about to meet an enemy that acted like water. The local resistance was incredibly fluid. It flowed around the British flanks, filled the empty spaces, and just drowned them from all sides.
To make matters worse, the British weren't just fighting the city streets. They were fighting the logistics of the 19th century. We are talking about transatlantic supply lines.
It's hard to overstate how difficult operating a fleet in the Rio de la Plata was. The estuary is incredibly wide, but it is plagued by shifting sandbanks and sudden violent storms called pamperos.
And the British lacked a permanent deep-water naval base nearby, didn't they?
They did. So once the land forces disembarked, they found themselves bogged down in coastal marshlands before they even reached the city limits. They couldn't easily bring their heavy artillery ashore.
They were exhausted before the fighting even started.
Exhausted, their uniforms were completely unsuited for the sweltering South American summer, and their supply lines back to the ships were immediately vulnerable.
But the crazy part is they marched into the city expecting the local government to hand them the keys. And initially, in 1806, they actually got a taste of that illusion, didn't they?
They did.
The first phase of this conflict saw a small British force under Sir William Beresford actually capture the city.
And that initial success was probably the worst thing that could have happened to the British because it just completely confirmed all their biases.
It validated the bad intelligence.
Exactly. When Beresford landed with roughly 1,500 men, the formal Spanish colonial administration just completely collapsed. The viceroy, who was the highest-ranking Spanish official, literally packed up the colonial treasury and fled into the interior.
Just took the money and ran.
Left them entirely. And the regular Spanish garrison offered very minimal resistance.
So if you are Beresford, you are sitting in the Cabildo thinking, the intelligence was right, the Spanish are weak, the city is ours, let the trade begin.
He fundamentally conflated the collapse of the formal government with the submission of the population.
Right.
The people of Buenos Aires watched their Spanish overlords just abandon them. They felt the humiliation of an invading force occupying their streets. And in that vacuum of leadership, the internal fractures we talked about between the Criollos, the Peninsulares, and the lower classes, they didn't widen, they fused.
It's kind of ironic, really. The invasion meant to exploit a fractured society. acted as the ultimate unifying catalyst. It forced a synthesis. And the catalyst for that synthesis was a man named Santiago de Liniers. Who was this guy? And how did he pull off one of the most incredible civilian mobilizations in history?
Lignier is such a fascinating historical paradox. He was a French-born nobleman serving as a naval officer for the Spanish crown. He wasn't a high-ranking politician. He was actually largely sidelined before the invasion.
Really?
Yeah. But when the British took the city and the viceroy fled, Lignier recognized that the formal military apparatus was just dead. If the city was going to be retaken, a movement that became known as the Reconquista, it had to be done by the people.
So he didn't try to organize a traditional army.
No, he knew that wouldn't work. He slipped out of the city, crossed the river to Montevideo, gathered what few regular troops he could find, and began this massive campaign of irregular mobilization.
But he had to bridge the massive class divides we talked about earlier. How do you convince a wealthy Criollo merchant to fight alongside a marginalized indigenous laborer?
By aligning their immediate survival and identity against a common alien enemy. Liniers proved to be just a masterful political operator. He engaged the wealthy commercial elites and convinced them to open their private coffers.
He needed cash.
He needed a lot of money to buy weapons, secure gunpowder, and fund a resistance, completely bypassing the paralyzed colonial bureaucracy.
That makes sense.
And simultaneously, he appealed to the rural gauchos, the nomadic, fiercely independent horsemen of the South American plains. These were men who lived outside the rigid colonial structures. They were masters of horsemanship, armed with knives and boleadoras.
So you have British infantrymen trained to fight in pristine lines on European battlefields, and they are about to face gauchos who view warfare as a fluid, chaotic hunt.
Exactly. Liniers organized this incredibly diverse mass into urban militias, categorized by their regional origins and social classes, but absolutely united in purpose. He didn't try to teach them linear volley fire. He adapted their existing skills to the urban terrain of Buenos Aires.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of the urban defense, the real nightmare that the British walked into when they returned in 1807. Because they came back with a massive reinforcement, right?
Over 10,000 troops.
Over 10,000 troops under General John Whitelock, intent on crushing the rebellion once and for all. So let's dive into the architecture of death that Liniers prepared for them. We talked about the Damaro, the grid system, but the real killer was the azoteas.
Ah, yes, the azoteas. They were the flat roofs of the colonial houses in Buenos Aires. Unlike the pitched roofs common in Europe, these houses had flat roofs designed to collect rainwater, and they were surrounded by low brick parapets.
So those parapets acted as pre-built sniper nests.
Precisely. When the British columns marched into the grid, Liniers didn't meet them in the intersections. He placed his militias on the azoteas.
So the British were trapped at street level.
Completely trapped. To return fire, a British soldier had to stop, point his highly inaccurate smoothbore musket upward at a severe angle, and try to hit a militiaman, exposing only his head and shoulders from behind a solid brick wall.
It was nearly impossible.
Almost mathematically impossible with that weapon. Meanwhile, the defenders on the roofs were just pouring plunging fire down into the packed British columns. But it wasn't just musket fire. The civilian population engaged in total logistical obstruction and psychological warfare.
It wasn't just soldiers on the roofs.
No, it was everyone. They threw heavy stones, they hurled homemade incendiary devices, they poured boiling water and heated sand down onto the troops below.
Heated sand, wow. That's horrifying.
That is brutal.
Let's focus on those columns trying to push through. The tactical turning point of this entire campaign really centers around the districts of San Telmo and Montserrat. The British strategy was still to just push through the streets and isolate the defensive positions. But Liniers had ordered the construction of massive barricades, and because they didn't have traditional military engineering supplies, the locals used the city itself.
They dug deep trenches across the narrow streets, and then behind the trenches, they piled up overturned merchant carts, massive barrels of hardened tallow, hide bales, and household furniture.
Just whatever they could find.
Whatever was heavy. They turned every intersection into an improvised fortress. When a British column reached one of these barricades, their momentum stopped completely. The steel beam hit a brick wall.
The source notes that the British tried to send engineers forward to dismantle these blockages.
It was an absolute suicide mission. The engineers were forced to stand in the open straight, hacking at tallow barrels with axes, while the militias on the surrounding azoteas just poured crossfire into them.
And what about their artillery?
The British attempted to deploy their light artillery, bringing up cannons to blast the barricades apart. But cannons firing solid iron round shot require a flat, clear trajectory to skip the ball through an enemy formation or shatter a wooden gate.
Right, bowling ball style.
Exactly. Firing round shot into a barricade made of compressed hide and tallow in a narrow street, it merely embedded the cannonball into the soft material. It completely absorbed the kinetic energy. The cannons were rendered useless.
And the cavalry, they had horses, right?
Completely neutralized. You cannot launch a cavalry charge down a 10-foot wide street blocked by trenches and wagons while taking sniper fire from above.
Yeah.
The horses panicked. The riders were picked off. All the technological advantages of the British military were stripped away by the environment.
Let's look at the psychological toll this takes on the British command structure. Because General Whitlock and the High Command are not in the streets. They're positioned on the periphery of the city, trying to manage a battle they cannot even see.
The fog of war descended instantly. Once the British columns entered the grid, communication just evaporated. In an open field, a general can see his battalions. He can send a rider with orders.
But in the city.
In the twisting, smoke-filled streets of Buenos Aires, a battalion commander had no idea what was happening one block over. Runners carrying orders were shot down in the intersections. Units became deeply fragmented and isolated.
It's like trying to navigate a massive, deadly maze where the walls themselves are shooting at you, your walkie-talkies are dead, and your map was drawn by someone who's never even been to the country.
That's a perfect way to describe it. They were fighting entirely blind. The local militias, on the other hand, had perfect intelligence.
Because the entire city acted as a surveillance network.
Yes. The residents knew exactly where the British were stalled, and they relayed that information to linieres through the back alleys and interconnected courtyards. The militias could fluidly redeploy, surround an isolated British regiment, and cut them to pieces.
The source material also mentions the terror of nighttime combat.
Yeah.
The British troops are already exhausted from the summer heat, suffering from dysentery from the marshlands and trapped in these streets.
And you have to understand, European armies of that era strictly avoided night combat whenever possible. Linear tactics required visibility. You can't fire a volley if you can't see the target.
But the local irregulars had no such constraints.
None at all. They harassed the isolated British pockets throughout the entire night. The British soldiers, unable to sleep, unable to see their enemy, surrounded by hostile civilians, they experienced a total collapse of morale.
So by August of 1807, the situation reaches its breaking point. Ligniers didn't just hold the line, he launched a concerted, multi-pronged counteroffensive.
The water flowing back against the shattered steel beam.
Exactly. The militia systematically surrounded the remaining British strongholds within the city. Entire British regiments were forced to surrender block by block.
And General Whitlock, who is receiving these fragmented, panicked reports of massive casualties and the surrender of his elite units, finally realizes the strategic reality. The cost of taking the city had spiraled infinitely beyond the projected economic benefits.
So he has to give up.
He agrees to a total capitulation.
The withdrawal itself was completely humiliating. They had to negotiate safe passage just to leave the city they had come to conquer. They marched back to their ships, leaving thousands of dead, wounded, and captured behind.
It was an unmitigated disaster for British imperial prestige. Whitlock returned to England in disgrace and was actually court-martialed. But the true legacy of this failure lies in the geopolitical synthesis that occurred in South America.
Because the British failed, because they conflated military firepower with political legitimacy.
Right. They assumed that a society unhappy with its rulers is a society just waiting to be conquered by someone else.
And in making that assumption, they sparked the very fire that would burn down the Spanish Empire.
The analysis in the text draws a direct line from 1807 to modern asymmetrical warfare. This campaign is a glaring historical proof that an expeditionary force cannot successfully occupy an urban environment without truly understanding the human terrain.
The human terrain is everything.
It really is. If you do not possess comprehensive intelligence about the social dynamics, if your command structure is rigid, and if you lack a strategy to integrate the civilian population, your technological superiority will be neutralized by the city itself.
So put your modern strategist hat on for a second. If you are a military planner, or even an executive expanding a business into a volatile new market today, looking at the blood on the streets of Buenos Aires in 1807, what is the loudest warning siren going off in your head?
The siren screams, "Do not confuse local friction with a desire for your intervention."
Oh, wow. That's a great way to put it.
Just because a market, a company, or a nation is deeply dissatisfied with its current leadership does not mean they view you as the solution. If you attempt to impose your rigid playbook onto a complex, living ecosystem that you haven't bothered to truly understand, that ecosystem will mobilize its unique advantages against you. The environment, whether it's the physical architecture of a city or the cultural architecture of a society, always dictates the terms of engagement.
You cannot dictate terms to a labyrinth once you are already lost inside it. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for anyone listening right now. We often look at history as a series of inevitable events, but the Rio de la Plata invasion is a masterclass in the lethal danger of assumed superiority.
Absolutely.
The British had the best navy, the best guns, and the best training, but they lacked empathy. They lacked the capacity to view the world through the eyes of the people they intended to rule.
And that lack of empathy costs them the continent.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We've detailed how the British invasion forced the deeply divided society of Buenos Aires to unite. They had to organize their own militias, fund their own defense, and elect their own leaders like Linier, all while the formal Spanish government proved completely useless.
Right, the Spanish just vanished.
So the people of Buenos Aires realized they didn't need Spain to protect them. They had defeated the world's greatest superpower entirely on their own. Think about the timeline. Just 3 years later, in 1810, the May Revolution ignites in Buenos Aires, kicking off the South American Wars of Independence.
It's an incredible chain of events.
Without the British accidentally providing a live fire exercise in national self-reliance, would the subsequent revolutions have ignited with such fierce confidence? In their catastrophic failure to conquer the Rio de la Plata, did the British Empire inadvertently forge the very national identity that would soon completely dismantle the Spanish Empire?
It is the ultimate historical irony. The British arrived to open a market, and instead, they forged a nation.
We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you next time.